All right, so what if I told you that one of the biggest corporate paydays in history wasn't just some brilliant business move? What if it was actually the direct trigger for a disaster that would kill millions of people? Well, that's exactly the story we're going to get into.
So picture this. It's August 12th, 1765. The Mughal emperor makes a decision that's going to change, well, pretty much everything. He hands over the right to collect all the taxes in Bengal to a British trading company, the East India Company. Now, let's be clear. This wasn't just some routine contract. This was a huge transfer of power. I mean, a private company was suddenly in charge of the entire treasury of one of the richest places on the planet.
But here's the twist. This moment of incredible corporate success, it was actually the seed for an absolute tragedy. Because just 5 years later, a massive famine hits Bengal, and 10 million people die.
So how on earth does that happen? How does a company's biggest payday lead directly to mass starvation? How does their greatest success story become one of the worst tragedies in history? Well, that's the puzzle we're going to piece together. Let's dive in.
Okay, so the key to this whole thing, the real heart of the matter, comes down to one single title the company was given, the Diwan. To get what happened, we really have to understand what that word meant and why it was such a big deal.
You know, it's funny. The company's guy in India, Robert Clive, he wanted this moment to be remembered forever. So he paid for this huge, grand painting of a fancy ceremony. But the reality? It was probably just a quick deal made inside his tent, kind of informal. And that difference between the fancy painting and the simple reality tells you everything. It shows you how the British saw this moment. It was the point where they stopped thinking of themselves as just traders and started seeing themselves as rulers.
And the power that came with that title? It was just immense. Being the Diwan didn't mean they were just collecting a small fee here or there. No, they took control of the entire financial system. They controlled all the money, every tax on land, on trade, you name it. Suddenly, their job was to manage the entire economy of the province. They basically got the keys to the kingdom.
And right here, this is where we get to the core of the problem. You see, the East India Company now had all the power of a government, but it was still thinking like a trader. It's like putting a wolf in charge of the henhouse. That basic conflict is exactly what set the stage for the disaster to come.
I mean, this quote just says it all. It wanted a large revenue income, but was unwilling to set up any regular system of assessment. So what does that mean? Basically, their goal was super simple. Get as much cash as they could, as quickly as they could. They just weren't interested in the boring, long-term work of actually governing. You know, setting up a fair tax system, putting money back into the land. Nope. Their one and only mission was profit, profit, profit.
And this new power was a complete game changer for them. Think about it. Before 1765, if the company wanted to buy Indian goods like cotton and silk, they had to ship over gold and silver from Britain to pay for it. But now, they didn't have to spend a single penny of their own money. They could literally use the taxes they collected from the people of Bengal to buy the products from the people of Bengal and then ship them off for a huge profit. It was a perfect self-funding machine.
And the effect on the company's profits was, well, immediate and just explosive. Just look at this chart. In only 5 years, the value of the goods they were shipping out of Bengal doubled. This new setup was an absolute goldmine for the shareholders sitting back in London. But there were two sides to this coin. While the company's bank accounts were getting fat, the actual economy of Bengal was being bled dry. This policy of just taking, without putting anything back, it started a terrible chain reaction that would spread across the whole province. So, it all started on the ground. First, the company jacked up taxes so high that peasants just couldn't pay. They were left with nothing. Then, you have the artisans, the people making all those amazing textiles. They were forced to sell their stuff to the company for ridiculously low prices. I mean, what choice did they have? Eventually, with no way to make a living, people just started leaving their villages. And just like that, everything started to crumble, both the crafts and the farming.
And you can imagine the ripple effect, right? If the farmers have no money to spend and the weavers have no goods to sell, what happens next? The local markets, you know, the places that were the absolute lifeblood of the economy, they just started to fail. The whole system was grinding to a stop.
So you have this economic collapse, right? All of it driven by the company's single-minded hunt for profit. It was the perfect storm for a human catastrophe. And in 1770, the storm hit.
So, what was the real cost of this new system? The company counted its profits in pounds and shillings, but the true price, that would be counted in human lives. 10 million people. That's the number.
the estimated number of people who died in the Bengal famine, an economic crisis created by a corporate policy, turned into one of the worst human disasters the region had ever seen.
And just to put that in perspective, this wasn't some small, isolated event. The famine wiped out 1/3 of the entire population of Bengal. Imagine that. 1 out of every 3 people, just gone.
So let's just break down the terrible logic here. You have a trading company that acts like a trader, not a ruler. It uses local taxes to buy local goods for export, which sucks all the money out of the economy. And because their only goal is profit with zero sense of responsibility, that leads to total collapse, and then to one of the worst famines in history.
But this catastrophe? It was a brutal lesson for the East India Company. They learned the hard way that you can't just bleed a country dry and expect everything to be fine. Which leaves us with one last, really important question. Now that they knew this, how would the company have to change its whole strategy? How would this disaster force it to stop being just a trader and start becoming a true colonial power?
You know, every empire, every big colonial project, it really all boils down to one thing: money. But what do you do when the place you've just taken over has an economy that's, well, in ruins? How are you supposed to pay for your government, your trade, your soldiers? This wasn't just a theoretical question. It was the exact massive problem staring the British East India Company right in the face when they were in India. So this really became the central question, didn't it? It drove decades of their policy. Because you have to remember, the company wasn't just some government body. It was a business, first and foremost. And like any business, it needed a steady, predictable income to stay afloat and, to grow. Their big idea? The answer, they were convinced, was in the land itself. Okay, so after years and years of debating this, the company officials finally landed on a plan. They figured if we want that steady cash flow, we've got to get people to invest in the land. We need to make agriculture better. And to pull that off, they realized they had to just rip up the old land revenue system and start fresh. And this decision kicked off a whole series of, well, massive social and economic experiments. First up, in 1793, they introduced something called the permanent settlement. But as you can see, it didn't take long for cracks to appear. By 1806, reports were already highlighting its failures. That forced them back to the drawing board, leading to new ideas like the Mahalwari settlement in 1822. So let's unpack exactly how this whole thing unfolded. All right, so let's talk about that first big idea, the permanent plan. This was the permanent settlement. It was this huge, really optimistic experiment. The idea was to create a system that would solve all their money problems in one go. And at the heart of this grand plan was a very specific type of local middleman. And that middleman was the zamindar. What the company did was they looked at the local rajas and talukdars, the existing power players, and basically said, congratulations, you are now officially the landowners. So the zamindars became these critical go-betweens. Their job was to collect rent from the peasants actually farming the land and then turn around and pay a fixed amount of that revenue to the company. On paper, the logic was brilliant. I mean, check this out. The amount the zamindar had to pay the company, it was fixed permanently. It would never, ever go up. So, boom, the company gets a steady, predictable income. But here's the clever part. Since the zamindar got to keep any money he collected above that fixed amount, he had every reason to invest, right? Improve the land, expand farming, because if the land produced more, he could collect more rent, and his profits would go up. It sounds like a perfect win-win situation. Yeah, well, it turns out reality had other plans. That neat, elegant theory, it just completely fell apart when it slammed into the real world of rural India. This grand plan that was supposed to bring prosperity, it ended up causing a whole host of brand new, massive problems. And you can see the total disconnect right here. Let's look at the idea versus what actually happened. For the company, sure, they got their stable income. But there was a catch. Because the revenue was fixed, they lost out completely when crop prices went up. They couldn't get a bigger slice of the pie. And the zamindars, the ones who were supposed to get rich and invest, the initial tax was set so incredibly high that tons of them just couldn't pay and ended up losing their land. The ones who did manage to hang on, they quickly figured out it was way easier to just squeeze more rent out of their tenants than to bother with risky investments. But the people who really paid the price were the cultivators, the actual farmers. They were just crushed under these insane rents with the constant fear of being kicked off their land. And this isn't just hindsight. This powerful quote from H.T. Colebrook, written way back in 1806, just lays bare the human cost. He wrote, The undertenants, depressed by an excessive rent, can never extricate themselves from debt. They earn a scanty subsistence without hope of bettering their situation. I mean, just listen to that. He's describing people trapped in a never-ending cycle of debt, barely surviving with absolutely no hope. The system that was meant to create a class of rich farmers was doing the exact opposite. It was creating a deeply oppressed and debt-ridden population.
So by the early 1800s, the writing was on the wall. The permanent settlement was, to put it mildly, a failure. On top of that, the company's own expenses for running the show and for trade were going up, and a revenue that was permanently fixed just wasn't going to cut it anymore. They needed more cash. It was time to go back to the drawing board.
And that led to two new big ideas, which you can see laid out here. They were designed for different parts of India. First, up in the northwestern provinces, you had the Mahalwari System. The idea here was to treat the entire village, the Mahal, as one big taxable unit. The village headman would be responsible for collecting the money from everyone and handing it over. Then, down in the south, they tried something different called the Ryotwari System. There weren't as many big zamindars there, so they just cut out the middleman completely. The company would collect the tax directly from the individual farmer, the Ryot. And here's the really important part. In both of these new systems, the revenue was no longer permanent. It was going to be revised periodically, maybe every 20 or 30 years. Now, this change in policy also brought a change in, well, philosophy, especially with that Ryotwari system. Its big champion, Thomas Monroe, had this idea that British officials should act like paternal father figures. They would protect the farmers. It was a real shift away from that hands-off approach of the permanent settlement. Now the company was going to be directly involved, acting as this, supposedly, kinder, gentler ruler. So, a new system, a new, more caring philosophy. You'd think things would get better, right? Well, unfortunately, it was the same old story. It only took a few years for everyone to see that despite all the changes, all was definitely not well. And it all came down to this one single core problem. It didn't matter who was collecting the tax, a zamindar, a village headman, or a British official. The fundamental issue was the same. The company was just so driven to squeeze out as much money as possible that the officials in charge set the tax demand way, way too high. I mean, just look at this. It was far more than the farmers could ever hope to pay. And the results? They were absolutely devastating. Since they couldn't possibly pay, farmers, the riots, had no choice but to just abandon their land and run. They fled the countryside. In a lot of places, entire villages just became ghost towns. That grand dream the company had of creating this new class of rich, successful farmers, it was a total, catastrophic failure. So it's pretty clear that these big experiments were an absolute disaster for the farmers of India. They basically locked in poverty and debt for generations to come. But that leaves us with one last, kinda uncomfortable question to chew on. These systems were a complete failure for the farmers, no doubt. But did they actually succeed for the East India Company? Did their ruthless drive for revenue actually work in the end for them? That's something to think about. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to dive into the hidden story of a color you probably see all the time, that deep, rich blue of indigo. It's a story of global trade, empire, and some serious conflict, all wrapped up in the color of your blue jeans. So let me ask you this. Can a color even have a history? It sounds a little weird, right? I mean, a color is just a color. But what if I told you that the story of this one specific blue dye literally shaped economies and changed millions of lives all around the world? Okay, let's start with something you might recognize. This is a classic, intricate floral print by the famous 19th century British artist William Morris. It's gorgeous, super detailed, and it just screams traditionally British. All right, now take a look at this. This is a traditional kalamkari print made by weavers way over in Andhra Pradesh, India. Again, absolutely beautiful, really detailed, but from a totally different part of the world with its own unique history. So what on earth is the connection between these two fabrics from opposite ends of the globe? Well, it's that rich blue color they both share. And that blue comes from a plant called indigo. In fact, it's almost certain that the blue in that very British Morris print was made from indigo plants grown in India, which was the world's biggest supplier back then. And that connection really gets us to the first part of our story, this massive global demand for blue, and why this one color became so incredibly valuable. You see, the indigo plant mostly grows in the tropics, and way back in the 13th century, Cloth makers in Italy, France, and Britain were already using it. But, and this is a big but, only tiny amounts of Indian indigo ever made it to Europe. And you know what that means? The price was through the roof. Now, European cloth makers did have their own local alternative called woad. But honestly, it was no competition. Woad gave you this pale, kind of dull blue. Indigo, on the other hand, gave you that rich, vibrant color everybody wanted. The difference was so huge that European woad producers actually begged their governments to ban indigo imports just to stay in business. But by the 17th century, the demand was just too strong, and those bans were lifted. Then, in the late 18th century, a perfect storm hits. First, Britain's Industrial Revolution kicks into high gear, and cotton production just explodes, creating this crazy demand for dye. At the exact same time, global indigo production suddenly collapses. It falls by half. And then the final blow comes in 1791, when the slave revolt in Saint-Domingue, a huge indigo producer, just completely wipes out the Caribbean supply chain. So, with its main sources gone and demand higher than ever, Britain was forced to make a really big bet. And that brings us to what we can call Britain's indigo gamble. The situation was, frankly, a disaster. Cloth dyers in Britain were getting desperate, searching for any new, stable source of indigo they could find. I mean, their entire textile industry was on the line. So, where do you think they looked? They turned to India. And just look at these numbers. In a little over 20 years, Indian indigo goes from supplying about a third of the British market to supplying almost all of it, 95%. Bengal's indigo basically took over the entire world market. This massive shift kicked off what was basically an indigo rush. With the trade booming, officials from the East India Company started throwing money into indigo production. A lot of them even quit their day jobs to become full-time indigo planters. You had Scotsmen and Englishmen flocking to India, all chasing these huge profits. And if you didn't have the cash to start up, no problem. You could get loans from the company or from all these new banks that were popping up. But turning India into the world's indigo factory wasn't so easy. This whole industrial pivot created a bunch of new problems on the ground. And that gets us to the big problem with the plantations. So how was all this indigo actually grown? Well, there were two main systems, Nij and Ryotwari. With the Nij system, the planter was in direct control. They'd buy or rent the land themselves and then hire laborers to work it. Pretty straightforward, right? Well, on paper, the Nij system gave planters total control. But in reality, it was a logistical nightmare. For starters, indigo needed really fertile land. But those areas were already packed with people and farms, so planters could only get these small, scattered plots, not the big, consolidated blocks they needed. And anytime they tried to lease land and kick out the local peasants, well, that always led to conflict. And then there was the labor problem. They needed tons of workers at the exact same time of year. Those workers were busy planting their own rice. And this number really just says it all. A single plantation of 1,000 bighas, which is a unit of land, needed 2,000 plows. 2,000! Trying to buy and maintain that many plows and the bullocks to pull them was a massive problem, especially when all the peasants' plows were already busy in their own rice fields. So the bottom line is the Nij's system just didn't work at a large scale. By the late 19th century, planters were really trying to avoid expanding it. As you can see here, less than 25% of indigo was grown that way. The vast majority was cultivated using that other method, the Ryotwari system. So the planters had to give up on their preferred method and switch almost entirely to the Ryotwari system. Now, this solved their land and labor problems, but it created a whole new and often brutal relationship with the local farmers, which leaves us with a really important question. What price would Indian farmers end up paying for Britain's obsession with the color blue? Today, we're jumping into a really dramatic chapter in history. It's a story about how a simple, beautiful color led to brutal oppression and then to a massive rebellion. This is the story of the Indigo Rebellion. So let's start with the big question. How on earth could a color, a dye for fabric, actually spark a revolution? It sounds kind of crazy, right? But to get how it all went down, you first have to understand the system that was built around it. You see, back in the 19th century, indigo was a huge deal. That deep blue color was in super high demand all over the world. So for European planters in Bengal, India, this was a massive opportunity to get rich. But the way they went about it, well, it was built entirely on control and coercion.
And right at the heart of this whole thing is the Ryot. That's the term for the Indian peasant farmers. These are the folks who worked the land, and they're the ones who got forced into a system that basically stole their freedom and their ability to make a living. So how did the planters manage to control the Ryot so completely? Well, they used this really clever and totally oppressive system called the Ryotwari System. On paper, it probably looked like a normal business deal, but in reality, it was a perfectly designed trap. And here's how that trap worked. It was a vicious cycle. First, a Ryot would be pressured, pretty much forced, to sign a contract and take a cash loan. But here's the catch. That contract meant he had to plant indigo on at least a quarter of his land, and not just any land, his best land. Then, when it was time to sell the harvest, the planter paid him a price so low, there was no way he could ever pay back the loan. So what happened next? Another loan was issued, and the cycle of debt just kept going year after year after year. This really lays out the core conflict, doesn't it? The planters wanted that prime soil for indigo because that's what made them money, but the Ryots needed that exact same soil to grow rice, the food that actually fed their families. And it gets worse. Indigo plants have these super deep roots that just wrecked the soil, making it useless for growing rice afterward. Their goals were just completely at odds. And the oppression wasn't just on paper, in the contracts. It was physical too. Let's shift from the fields to the factories for a minute, because the labor it took to turn this green plant into a blue dye was just absolutely backbreaking. It was this whole complicated process, right? First, they'd soak the harvested leaves in a giant vat to ferment. Then they'd drain that liquid into another vat where workers would have to beat it with paddles for hours and hours. Eventually, the solution turns blue, and this indigo gunk settles at the bottom. That pulp then gets pressed and dried into cakes to be sold. Just let that sink in for a second. That part where they're beating the liquid, it was unbelievably brutal. People had to stand in waist-deep, probably disgusting water for 8, sometimes more than 8, hours a day, just constantly churning it with these heavy paddles. It was exhausting, relentless work. That was the daily reality. So, after decades of being squeezed financially and physically abused, something had to give. And it did. This brings us to the climax of the story, the Great Blue Rebellion. There was even a popular song at the time that captured the feeling perfectly, saying that the Ryots will no longer be beaten in silence. That moment finally arrived in March of 1859. In this huge, coordinated act of defiance, thousands and thousands of Ryots all across Bengal just stopped. They refused to grow indigo. The rebellion was on. And believe me, this was not a quiet protest. It was an all-out revolt. Ryots refused to pay their rents. They attacked the indigo factories with whatever they had: swords, spears, bows, and arrows. What's amazing is how the entire community got involved. Women jumped into the fight using pots, pans, whatever they could grab from the kitchen. They completely socially boycotted anyone who still worked for the planters. And the Gomastas, the agents sent to collect the debts, they got beaten up. So you have to ask, right, after all those years of suffering, what changed? What finally gave these farmers the power and the courage to fight back on such a massive scale? Well, it wasn't just one thing, it was kind of a perfect storm. For one, they finally got support from local village headmen and even some landlords, who were also getting sick of the planters' power. This created this incredible sense of unity. But what's really fascinating is that they started to believe the British government was actually on their side. A rumor spread that Queen Victoria herself had declared they didn't have to grow indigo anymore. It gave them immense hope. But if you want to understand the heart and soul of this rebellion, it all comes down to this one quote. A cultivator named Haji Mullah was being questioned by a commission, and they asked him what it would take for him to grow indigo again. His answer was just absolute. He said, "I am not willing to sow. I would rather beg than sow indigo." Wow. I mean, with that kind of raw, powerful feeling spreading everywhere, the government couldn't ignore it anymore. They were so worried about how big this rebellion was getting that they had to launch an investigation. And what they found would bring the whole system crashing down. The government set up something called the Indigo Commission, and its final report was a total victory for the Ryots. Let's look at the verdict. The commission found the planters guilty of using force and cruel methods. It said flat out that growing indigo was not profitable for the Ryots. And here's the biggest one. It ruled that from now on, Ryots could refuse to sign indigo contracts. The trap was finally broken. And the effect was immediate. After that ruling, indigo production in Bengal just collapsed. The planters tried to move their operations to another region, Bihar, but their time was running out anyway because synthetic dyes were invented soon after. But the story doesn't end there. In 1917, a young lawyer you might have heard of, Mahatma Gandhi, visited indigo farmers, and their struggle helped light the spark for a whole new movement. So, the Blue Rebellion was a huge win for the riots of Bengal, but their fight ended up becoming part of a much, much bigger story. It's a powerful reminder that fighting one unjust system is often just the beginning. And it leaves us with a really important question to think about. What does it actually take to turn a single protest into a movement that can change history?